So you may say, well, I'm not very much of a talker. Uh, I'm not very well spoken. I'm shy. I get nervous. And quite frankly, I don't know enough to even talk about it. Well, if we look up at Colossians 12, it says, "Since God chose you to be the holy people He loves, you must clothe yourselves with tender heart and mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience." Uh, when it says clothe yourselves, if we think of that of like clothing our body, we're covering our body. So it's telling us to cover ourselves uh, with tender heart and mercy. Be merciful, kindness, be kind to people, humility, be humble, gentleness, and patience. So let's just say that you're a very fiery person. You're quick to get aggravated. You got a quick temper. You're quick at the tongue to rattle off foul language or whatever it may be. Nowhere in verse 12 does it say anything about talking or knowing everything or having all the knowledge. It tells you to clothe yourselves with tender heart and mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. So if we look at it like this, we say, well, I know this old cuz over there, I ain't heard him cuss lately. Or old lady over there, I ain't really seen her get mad in the last couple of weeks, or I ain't really heard her talk bad about nobody, or I ain't heard this or I ain't heard that. The things that people are used to hearing or seeing you do, they start noticing changes, and nowhere in that did you say anything about how much I've learned, or I know this, or I know that, or I know the direct call of my life. No, when you apply the clothing yourself with tender heart and mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, it changes the way that we hold ourselves, the way that we act, the way that we conduct ourselves, and it speaks a lot louder volumes in the way that we act versus anything that we can physically say out of our mouth. Um, so back to the not knowing exactly what the calling is, and back to the sharing the good news that's been happening for over 2,000 years now. Colossians 16:17 says, "Let the message about Christ and all its richness fill your lives. Teach and counsel each other with all the wisdom He gives. Sing psalms, hymns, spiritual songs to God with thankful hearts. And whatever you do," 17, "or say, do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through Him to God the Father." So in 16, it tells us to teach and counsel each other with all the wisdom He gives. So right there it says wisdom that He gives, meaning we're not naturally born with knowing everything. We're not naturally born with knowing everything this book says. It's things that once we uh, start reading this, we keep our faith in this, and we apply what this book says to our lives, He gives us deeper wisdom and understanding for what His Word says and how it is to be applied to our life. Then in 17 it says, and do, tying back into verse 12, "and whatever you do or say, do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus." So if we are a representative, we are representing in a way like 12, where we are clothing ourselves with tenderhearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, because and giving thanks through Him to God the Father. So the more that we read His Word and we apply it to our life, ultimately the goal is to become more like Him. Um, so nowhere in any of that does it tell us what we are to say or what words we are supposed to speak out of our mouth, or nowhere in that does it say you can't do this unless you know what the long-term calling is on your life. It just tells us how we are to conduct ourselves, uh, how we are supposed to act, and understand that the wisdom, long term wisdom, is granted through Him and at His time only. Um, so it's a conscious effort to apply these things to our life to become more like Him. Pray and asking for wisdom to understand what His Word says, asking for wisdom to understand how to apply it to our lives. And the more that we do that, the more we learn, the more that He shows up, the more He reveals. And you learn how to have the conversations. He gives the wisdom when you're in a conversation with somebody or you're in a situation where He is to have you move and He is to have you have an influence, positive influence on somebody's life. He will give us the wisdom and the words to say at that time because it's never the words of us. It's never Hayden's words. It's never what Hayden wants to say. It's what he puts in our hearts that somebody else needs to hear at just the right time. Um, so just I encourage you to read Colossians 12, 16, and 17. You can read that on through if you want to, but just those three verses, 12, 16, and 17, it all ties together into gaining more wisdom through acting and conducting ourselves in the way that He would have us live our life. So don't focus on the words. Don't focus on knowing everything. Don't focus on how much it is I do or don't know. Focus on living the life that He called us to live and understanding that He will give us wisdom at the time that He sees fit.